Section 1. Maps of Tartaria. Somewhere between the 16th and 19th centuries, European mapmakers kept drawing a country that, according to modern textbooks, never really existed. Open an old atlas from that period and you'll likely find a vast stretch of northern Asia labeled Tartary, or Great Tartary, a territory so large it would rival the biggest empires in recorded history. Today, you won't find that name in any school curriculum. Ask most people what Tartary was, and you'll get a blank stare. So, what happened to it? Was it simply an old catch-all term that quietly fell out of use? Or is there a stranger story behind its disappearance? Let's start with the part of this mystery anyone can verify for themselves: the maps. Between roughly 1500 and 1800, cartographers across Europe, in France, England, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, repeatedly drew the same enormous region stretching from the Ural Mountains across Siberia, down through Central Asia, and toward the Pacific coast. This wasn't a one-off label used by a single confused mapmaker. It shows up again and again across generations of cartographers who, in many cases, never worked with each other and had limited access to first-hand information about the region. On some maps, the territory is split into subregions: Chinese Tartary along the eastern edge, Russian Tartary to the north and west, independent Tartary somewhere in between. That level of internal detail is worth pausing on. If Tartary were just a vague placeholder for unknown lands full of nomads, why would different mapmakers, working independently, consistently divide it the same way? There's also the matter of scale and placement. Despite limited communication between countries by modern standards, maps produced decades apart and hundreds of miles apart from each other's origin still tend to place Tartary in roughly the same location, with roughly the same borders. That kind of agreement is unusual for a term historians now describe as vague and imprecise. Then, over the course of the 19th century, something changes. New editions of maps start dropping the name. The territory gets carved up into the countries and regions we recognize on a modern map: Russia, Mongolia, parts of China, and Central Asia. Within a few decades, Tartary essentially disappears from mainstream cartography altogether. The conventional explanation is straightforward. As European exploration and diplomacy expanded, cartographers gained access to better information. Vague regional labels got replaced by more precise political boundaries, the same way the Orient, or Indian Territory, eventually gave way to more specific, accurate names as geographic knowledge improved. It's not a mysterious process. It's just what happens as maps get more accurate over time. Skeptics of that explanation aren't fully convinced. To them, 3 centuries is a long time for a supposedly vague, inaccurate term to persist unchanged, only to vanish within a generation or two. If Tartary was simply bad geography, why did it take so long to correct? And if it represented something more specific, an actual political entity, a real civilization, what exactly happened to it? That question alone has fueled entire communities of online researchers, several books, and countless YouTube documentaries. Section 2. Rapid construction / World's Fairs. But the maps, as it turns out, are just the opening chapter. Because at almost exactly the same time, this name was fading from atlases. Something else, arguably even stranger, was happening on the ground. An explosion of extraordinary architecture across 2 continents. The buildings that shouldn't have been possible. Picture a city skyline in the late 1800s. Grand railway terminals with soaring iron and glass ceilings. Government buildings with hand-carved facades stretching an entire city block. Cathedrals, opera houses, public libraries, structures dense with ornamental stonework, sculpture, and architectural detail that modern construction crews, with all our machinery and computer modeling, would struggle to replicate quickly today. The mainstream explanation is the Industrial Revolution, and it's a genuinely powerful one. His was a period of enormous technological change. Structural steel became widely available, steam-powered machinery made quarrying and transport faster, railroads let material move across countries in days instead of months, and cities had access to large, organized labor forces in a way that simply hadn't existed before. Under those conditions, rapid, large-scale construction wasn't just possible. It was, in some sense, the whole point of the era. Still, some researchers looking at these buildings raise an eyebrow. Consider the level of detail. Intricate, hand-carved capitals atop columns, ornamental cornices running the length of entire buildings, sculptural friezes depicting mythological or historical scenes. This is the kind of craftsmanship that, in earlier centuries, was associated with cathedral projects spanning generations. And yet, in the 1800s, entire complexes of similarly ornate buildings were reportedly finished in a matter of months or a couple of years. The most cited example is Chicago's World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, the famous White City. Officially, this was a temporary fairground, more than 600 acres, hundreds of monumental neoclassical buildings, canals, statuary, elaborate landscaping, all supposedly designed and constructed in under 2 years. Millions of visitors walked through it. Photographs from the period show buildings that look, by any reasonable modern estimate, like they should have taken far longer to plan and build. Supporters of the Tartaria theory ask a pointed question here. Were these buildings actually built for the fair? Or were they already standing, restored, and repurposed for the occasion, and then quietly demolished afterward to erase the evidence? Their argument leans heavily on the aftermath. Shortly after the exposition closed, virtually every building was torn down. The official reason given was that the structures were only ever meant to be temporary, built from staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and fiber, rather than true stone. To mainstream historians, that's simply how 19th century world's fairs operated. Temporary exhibition architecture was common practice. Fairs were meant to dazzle for a single season, not last for centuries, and dismantling them afterward freed up valuable land and avoided ongoing maintenance costs. To skeptics, the speed of the demolition still feels suspicious. An enormous investment of money and labor, gone within months, with comparatively little surviving documentation of the actual construction process itself. Plenty of photographs exist of the finished buildings and of their demolition. Detailed photographs of scaffolding, cranes, or workers mid-construction are noticeably harder to find. A similar pattern shows up again just over 20 years later in San Francisco. In 1906, the city was leveled by one of the most devastating earthquakes in American history, followed by fires that destroyed even more of what the quake left standing. Yet, less than a decade later, in 1915, San Francisco hosted its own World's Fair, the Panama Pacific International Exposition, complete with the now iconic Palace of Fine Arts and a sprawling complex of equally ornate exhibition halls. Historians point to the enormous financial investment the city poured into rebuilding, the availability of skilled tradespeople displaced by the disaster, and civic determination to prove the city's resilience on the world stage. It's a compelling explanation for a genuinely impressive recovery. For theorists who question the official timeline, though, it raises the same basic question as Chicago. How does a city recovering from near total destruction produce, within a matter of years, architecture of this scale and sophistication, and then dismantle much of it again once the fair ended? Whether you find that suspicious or simply impressive says a lot about how much weight you give to 19th century engineering ambition. But the mystery, according to Tartaria researchers, doesn't stop at ground level. It goes underneath the streets themselves. Section 3. The Mud Flood. The Mud Flood and the cities below the cities. Walk through the historic core of certain old cities. Seattle is the most commonly cited example, but similar oddities show up in parts of Chicago, Boston, London, and St. Petersburg. And you'll sometimes notice something strange about the buildings. Windows sitting just barely above sidewalk level. Doorways positioned oddly low, as though built for a street that no longer exists. In some buildings, what looks from the outside like the ground floor is actually, once you step inside, the second floor, with an entire buried level beneath it. Seattle's famous underground tour is built around exactly this phenomenon. An older layer of the city, complete with intact storefronts and sidewalks, sitting below the modern street grade. It's marketed today as a quirky historical curiosity. To supporters of the Tartaria theory, it's something more significant. Physical proof that a catastrophic event, sometime in the 1800s, buried large parts of cities under mud, silt, and debris, leaving only the upper floors of much larger buildings visible above ground. They call this the Great Mud Flood, and they argue it wasn't confined to one city, that construction crews around the world periodically stumble onto buried staircases, arches, and tunnels that don't match any known record of what used to be there. The conventional explanation for Seattle specifically is well documented. After a massive fire in 1889 destroyed much of the city's business district, planners deliberately regraded the streets, in some cases raising them by a full story, to solve chronic drainage and flooding problems. Rather than tear down and rebuild everything, many merchants simply reopened on the new upper level, while their old storefronts remained intact below, eventually becoming the underground that tourists walk through today. It's a well-recorded piece of civic engineering, not a mystery. Mudflood proponents counter that Seattle's regrading, however well documented, doesn't necessarily explain every similar case elsewhere. They point out that in some locations, the buried portions of buildings appear too extensive or too well preserved to be explained by ordinary incremental street raising. Whether that observation reflects a genuine, unexplained pattern or simply reflects how selectively these examples get chosen and presented online is very much a matter of debate, and so far, no geological or archaeological evidence has confirmed a global flood event capable of burying cities on the scale the theory describes. Section 4. Star Forts and Acoustics. The buried city theme connects to one more architectural oddity, the Star Fort. These geometrically precise, multi-pointed fortifications appear across Europe, the Americas, and parts of Asia, often visible only as a clear, symmetrical shape from the air. Historically, their design served a very specific military function during the age of cannon warfare. Angled bastions eliminated blind spots and deflected cannon fire far more effectively than older, straight-walled castle designs. That explanation is well supported by military history and by the fact that Star Fort construction spread rapidly once cannons became common on European battlefields. Tartaria researchers look at the same forts and see something different. A level of mathematical precision they argue goes beyond what pure defense would require, leading some to speculate, without hard evidence, that these structures may have functioned as part of some larger system involving sound, resonance, or energy transmission, rather than warfare alone. That idea connects to another commonly cited piece of evidence: the unusual acoustic properties inside many old cathedrals and government buildings, where a whisper at one end of a hall can be heard with startling clarity at the other. Acoustics is, in fact, a well-understood branch of architecture. Domes, vaulted ceilings, and specific proportions really do shape how sound travels, and architects have exploited those properties intentionally for centuries in everything from Byzantine churches to modern concert halls. Whether that also implies some lost free energy technology, as some corners of the theory suggest, remains entirely speculative and unsupported by any verified archaeological finding. Section 5. Giants and Missing Evidence. Giants, Vanished Evidence, and Old Legends. If these buildings really were built by or for an entirely different civilization, one question naturally follows. What did that civilization actually look like? This is where the Tartaria theory takes its boldest turn. Supporters point to the sheer scale of doorways, staircases, and ceilings in some of the grandest 19th century buildings, proportions that, they argue, seem excessive even by the standards of monumental architecture. From there, the theory proposes that these structures weren't simply built to impress ordinary sized visitors, but were built by or for people who were physically much larger than modern humans. As supporting evidence, believers point to newspaper articles from the 1800s and early 1900s, and there really are quite a few of them, describing the discovery of unusually large human skeletons during construction, mining, and archaeological digs across the United States, with reported heights of 7, 8, even 9 feet. According to the theory, many of these remains were later quietly acquired and hidden by institutions such as the Smithsonian, kept out of public and scientific access ever since. It's worth being direct about the evidence here. No verified giant skeletons have ever surfaced in a modern, peer-reviewed archaeological context, and the Smithsonian has publicly and repeatedly denied any organized effort to conceal such findings. Many of the original newspaper stories are difficult or impossible to independently verify, and 19th century journalism was well known for embellishing or outright fabricating sensational stories to sell papers. Misidentified fossil bones, exaggerated measurements, and outright hoaxes were common enough that historians generally treat these accounts with real skepticism. And yet, the idea has staying power, in part because giants show up in the origin stories of nearly every culture on Earth. The Nephilim in the Hebrew Bible, the Titans of Greek mythology, older and more primal than the Olympian gods who eventually overthrew them. Giants in Norse cosmology, present at the very creation of the world. Oral traditions among numerous Native American nations describing tribes of unusually tall, powerful people who lived on the land long before recorded history. Are these independent cultures preserving some kind of shared folk memory of something real? Or is it simply a recurring, universally appealing narrative archetype, the kind of larger-than-life origin story every culture tends to invent? Historians and folklorists generally favor the second explanation, but the sheer consistency of these stories across unconnected cultures is genuinely one of the more interesting threads in this whole mystery, whatever the ultimate explanation turns out to be. Section 6, Cover-Up Theory / Empty Streets. The idea of a cover-up. Pull every thread of this theory together. The vanishing maps, the too-fast architecture, the buried streets, the star forts, the giant legends, and you land on its most sweeping claim, that all of it points to a deliberate, coordinated erasure of history, sometimes referred to online as the Great Reset, a term borrowed and repurposed from unrelated modern discussions, worth noting so it isn't confused with them. Under this reading, some of the era's best documented catastrophes get reframed as deliberate cover-ups. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which really did level a huge portion of the city. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire. The staggering destruction of 2 world wars in the following decades. According to the theory, these weren't simply historical tragedies. They were convenient opportunities to finish erasing whatever remained of an older, more advanced civilization. It's a dramatic claim, and it runs directly against an enormous body of well-documented history. Each of these events has extensive contemporary documentation, eyewitness testimony, government records, insurance claims, engineering reports, newspaper coverage from multiple independent sources, and, for the 20th century events especially, photographic and even film evidence. Historians have found no credible indication that any of them were staged or exploited as part of a coordinated effort to hide anything. The scale of coordination such a cover-up would require, spanning multiple countries, governments, and generations, without a single verifiable leak or confession in over a century, is, to most researchers, simply implausible on its face. One more piece of evidence deserves a closer look, though, because it's genuinely striking at first glance. Old photographs of city streets from the late 1800s that look eerily empty. Wide boulevards with no pedestrians. Grand public squares with no crowds. To someone scrolling through these images online, it can look almost staged, like a movie set before the actors arrive. The explanation here is actually one of the more solid ones in this entire theory, and it comes down to photographic technology. Early cameras required exposure times of several seconds, sometimes longer. Anything moving during that exposure, a person walking, a horse trotting, a carriage rolling by, simply wouldn't register clearly enough to show up in the final image, effectively vanishing from the photograph. Combine that with the simple fact that 19th century cities, while busy by the standards of their time, had nowhere near the population density of a modern city, and empty-looking streets in old photographs stop looking mysterious and start looking exactly like what basic physics and demographics would predict. So, what's actually going on here? Strip away the more speculative claims, and what's left is a collection of genuinely real, genuinely documented historical facts. The maps did exist, and Tartary really was a common cartographic label for centuries. The buildings really were built quickly, by standards that still impress architects and engineers today. Cities like Seattle really do have buried streets beneath their modern surface. Star forts really are scattered across multiple continents, and their acoustics really are remarkable. None of that is in dispute. What's in dispute is the connective tissue, the idea that all of these separate, well-documented historical facts are actually fragments of one single, deliberately erased civilization, rather than what mainstream historians see them as, the unrelated byproducts of rapid industrialization, evolving urban planning, military engineering trends, sensationalist journalism, and the physical limitations of early photography. Maybe that's the real reason this particular mystery has refused to go away, decades after it first started circulating. It doesn't ask you to believe something entirely disconnected from reality. It takes real maps, real buildings, real photographs, and real historical oddities, and asks you to imagine a different story behind them. Whether you find that story compelling or simply entertaining is, in the end, entirely up to you.